Hi everybody and welcome back. This is yours truly, your host B9400 Ben Discusses History. And in today's episode, we're going to be discussing the old Kowloon Walled City that has long since been demolished. And prior to it being demolished, in the late 1990s, specifically 1994, it was located upon the Kowloon Peninsula, right next to the Victoria Harbor, within the territory of Hong Kong, directly across from Macau, which is not only a former Portuguese colony, it's also the Hong Kong Chinese uh, Cantonese equivalent of Las Vegas, for those of you that don't know. Anyway, let's get into it, shall we? The history of Kowloon Walled City. Jiulong Zhao Cheng, which is the Cantonese translation of Kowloon Walled City. My apologies if I in any way, shape, or form mispronounced that incorrectly for native speakers. And if you do believe that to be the case, then by all means, please let me know down below in the comments section. The Kowloon Walled City is one of the most fascinating and complex urban stories in modern history, a tale of politics, colonial tension, and human resilience. Now, I'm going to take you through a detailed chronological account of how the settlement evolved from a Chinese military outpost into the world's most densely populated settlement until its demolition in the early 1990s, specifically 1994. Origins: the imperial fort prior to the year 1842, and starting with the Song dynasty, which lasted from 960 BC until 1279, the area that became known as the Kowloon Walled City was originally a small coastal village near a salt yard that was primarily used for local administration and defense. And then came along the late Ming and Qing dynasties. The site grew into a small fortification to manage the local salt trade and defend against pirates and piracy. The early Ming period and the British encroachment upon the territory, starting in 1842 and ultimately concluding in 1898. And starting in 1842, there was an event known as the Treaty of Nanking, and this was following the First Opium War, where China officially ceded Hong Kong Island to the Imperial British Empire of the United Kingdom of Great Britain. The Qing government at the time, concerned about British influence spreading north, fortified a small garrison north of Victoria Harbor, which ultimately became to be known as the Kowloon Walled City, in order to assert its presence within the territory. And 5 years later, in 1847, construction officially began on a walled fortress that contained barracks, offices, and a yamen, an administrative office, basically. The wall was built of stone and brick, measuring about 700 feet by 400 feet, with 6 watchtowers and a defensive moat. About 150 soldiers were stationed there. And by 1860, there was the Convention of Peking. The Kowloon Peninsula south of Boundary Street was ceded to the Imperial British Empire, but the treaty specifically excluded the walled city, which remained under Chinese jurisdiction. From military outpost to no man's land, officially starting in 1898 and concluding in 1945, which was the year the Second World War ended, with the defeats of both Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, and starting in 1898, before we get into any of that, there was a convention for the extension of Hong Kong territory. The Imperial British Empire leased the new territories for a period of 99 years, but agreed that the walled city would remain Chinese property, provided China didn't interfere with the British administration of the surrounding area. And the following year, in 1899, when the Imperial British forces attempted to take control, they met brief resistance from the small Chinese garrison stationed at the fort at the time. The soldiers soon withdrew, and Britain took de facto control, but neither side dismantled the legal ambiguity. However, the city quickly fell into neglect. The fort's buildings decayed and most military personnel left, and by the 1930s, only a few hundred civilians, mostly squatters, lived within the walls. Japanese occupation and post-war chaos, starting in 1941 when the Imperial Japanese forces attacked the American military base of Pearl Harbor located upon the island of Hawaii up until the 1950s. In 1941 until 1945, that's World War II, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Japanese imperial forces occupied Hong Kong. They demolished parts of the city wall to use the stones for Tai Kak Airport extension nearby. And by 1945, when the war officially ended, with the surrenders of Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany, specifically Imperial Japan surrendered, thousands of refugees from across the border in mainland China flooded into the territory of Hong Kong, many of whom squatted in the walled city settlement. And by 1947, there were around 2,000 residents living in makeshift homes within the densely populated settlement. And by 1948, the Imperial British Empire attempted to evict the inhabitants, but the Chinese government protested, claiming sovereignty. This stalemate created a legal vacuum. Kowloon Walled City was technically Chinese territory, but under British colonial jurisdiction, with neither side actively governing the settlement. The rise of the vertical slum of 1950s until the 1980s. Through the 1950s and 1960s, thousands of refugees, gangsters, and families moved in, attracted by the lack of rent, laxes, or regulations. Basically, long story short, the city was a world of its own where the rule of law basically ceased to exist, and local authorities wouldn't dare go in there at risk of getting lost in the dense maze that it was. Anyway, the walled city expanded upwards instead of outward as people built new floors on top of existing ones, often without architects' permits or engineering oversight, and by the 1970s, over 300 interconnected buildings rose up to 14 stories high, crammed into a 6.4-acre space. Population density. At its peak in the 1980s, approximately 33,000 to 35,000 people lived there, a density of 1.9 million people per square kilometer, making it the densest human settlement in history at the time. And despite the vast squalor within the walls of the settlement, the walled city functioned as a self-contained ecosystem. Shops and industries, factories produced noodles, fish balls, textiles, and plastic goods. There were schools and clinics that were mostly run by local charities or residents, and those charities were mostly foreign from predominantly Western nations such as the United States, United Kingdom, Australia, etc., etc. Then you have organized crime, specifically the infamous triads, who dealt in and still do deal in drugs, gambling, and prostitution. And these vices thrived within the walls of the settlement, especially under Sun Yee-on and the 14K triad control at the time. There was no sunlight or sanitation within the settlement. Corridors were dark and wet, with tangled wires and leaking pipes, yet a strong sense of community developed. Residents often looked at each other, and violence was mostly confined to criminal circles within its walls. Evacuation and demolition, starting in the 1980s and concluding in the early 1990s, specifically 1994. And by 1984, the Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed, whilst a certain Margaret Thatcher, nicknamed the Iron Lady, was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Anyway, as Britain prepared to hand the territory of Hong Kong back to the People's Republic of China in 1997, both governments agreed to remove the walled city, which was seen as an embarrassment to both respective governments. And by 3 years later, in 1987, official announcement of clearance. Residents were compensated around 2.7 billion in total, Hong Kong dollars that is, though many resisted eviction and protested until the very end. And from 1991 until 1992, demolition officially began, with the last residents evicted by the summer of 1992, specifically July of that year. Then from 1993 until 1994, the city was completely demolished, reduced to ash and rubble. Legacy and the Kowloon Walled City Park. In 1995, the Kowloon Walled City Park opened on the same site of which the settlement originally stood. It's designed in the style of a Qing dynasty garden, with a reconstructed south gate, restored yamen, and historical plaques marking the original footprint of the settlement. The park serves as both as a memorial and symbol of what was lost and what endured. Kowloon Walled City has become a cultural icon representing both chaotic urbanism and human adaptability. The infamous settlement has been featured in various media platforms, such as the 1988 movie entitled Bloodsport that starred action star Belgian Jean-Claude Van Damme, and Time Cop that was released in 1994, Japanese anime, specifically titles Ghost in the Shell and Akira, popular video games such as Shenmue 2, Call of Duty Black Ops, and Stray. Its architecture and density inspired cyberpunk worlds, notably the movie trilogy Blade Runner and Hong Kong sci-fi aesthetics. Now, I'm going to take you through a little uh, timeline from of the settlement's early history right up until it was demolished. So, just prior to the year 1842, it was basically a small Chinese fort, or by official definition, it was seen as a imperial outpost. Then the following year, up until 1898, the British encroached upon the territory of Hong Kong, and the Qing dynasty at the time's military held out, and it was basically used as a military garrison. And then the following year, up until the end of World War II in 1945, the Imperial Japanese forces neglected the territory of Hong Kong, and they severely neglected it to the point that the outpost at the time became abandoned to the point of ruin. And then up until the 1980s, there was a large influx of refugees from across the border, that being the Chinese mainland, into Hong Kong, basically turning the settlement into one of the densest slum dwellings on planet Earth at the time. And then, starting in 1987 and concluding in 1994, the eviction process started, and residents were compensated and relocated, though some, on the other hand, resisted until the very end, and then came along 1994, and the whole thing was knocked down, reduced to ash and rubble. And then the following year, in 1995, a park went up in its place, and it's been there ever since. It's a popular tourist attraction, by the way, and I recommend you pay a visit to it if you ever get a chance to visit Hong Kong one day. It's called the Kowloon Walled City Park. Anyway, that just about wraps up today's episode of my Hong Kong history series. If you liked what you watched and listened to, then by all means like the video, leave a comment down below. I love hearing what you have to say. Also, subscribe to the channel. It helps me out a lot. It's much appreciated. And until next time, there's definitely more to come in my in this new series of mine that I've decided to title Hong Kong History. Catch you later. That's all I gotta say for today.